Welcome to Talking History, a series of talks from the Farnham U3A World History Group. The views expressed in this talk are representative of the views held at the time of the material being discussed. They do not necessarily represent the views of the speaker, the Farnham U3A World History Group, nor the team at the Mr. T podcast studio. In this talk, entitled When Newspapers Were Pressed to Be Right-Minded, Andrew Cole tells us about the taxes that were levied on the press as a form of censorship. He tells us about the repeal after 140 years and how it led to the press of today.
We take for granted that we have a relatively free press in Britain today, albeit not always a responsible one. But the arrival of the printing press presented a threat to those in authority. They wanted control. Today we're exploring how this was done, in particular how taxation was used to suppress unwanted publications and encourage what the establishment called the right-minded press. These taxes became known as the taxes on knowledge. The story is often told as a fight for freedom that brought liberty, due scrutiny of those in charge, and enabled political awakenment of the masses. But it's not as glossy as that. Historians, as always, have quite differing interpretations. I've bounded the scope as follows. The coverage is the attempted control of newspapers and their narrative through taxation. The tax's lifespan was 1712 to 1861, so 140 years. Though I'll include earlier context and the later outcomes. And the geography, I'm afraid, is England-centric. There is some provincial papers covered, but much of it emanates from London. And the approach I'm using is chronological. The background first, then the introduction to how the taxes got introduced, how they actually worked, and then how they were repealed and what happened as a consequence. Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press in the 1450s in Mainz, Germany. Previously, books had largely been copied by hand, dominated by educated monastery monks and officials. William Caxton traded as a mercer in northwestern Europe and learnt how to print in Cologne. In around 1476, he set up England's first print shop near Westminster Abbey. By the time of Henry VIII, printing presses were relatively cheap and portable, not portable as we would understand it now. A press in the wrong hands could be subversive. He brought in strict import controls and in 1538 decreed that all printing matter had to be pre-approved by the Privy Council or their deputies. And in the late 1540s, Edward VI went one stage further, making printing a royal prerogative. In 1557, the Stationers' Company received its royal charter from Mary I, giving the company powers to decree who could print books, search and seize illicit or pirated works, effectively an oligarchy for its members. And for 100 years, there were uncontinuous ad hoc controlled publications. The exception was during the Civil War, when the whole system broke down. There were many new publications with political and religious content, which largely continued through Cromwell's rule. After Restoration, the Crown came back. The 1662, a critical period this one, Licensing Act, brought back censorship with tight rules on pre-approval of printed text and the stationer's monopoly restored. There were publications that criticised authorities or made political commentary, but court authors or printers would be fined or imprisoned. But the Licensing Act lapsed in 1695, with the House of Commons reasoning that punishment through the common law made the Licensing Act no longer necessary. Rather than accepting that there was so much clandestine print, the law was actually unworkable. The demise is recorded on a technicality. But without the Licensing Act, publishing of all ilks bloomed. The next 15 years saw multiple attempts for the Licensing Act to be restored, but each failed to get parliamentary approval. Most historians recognise the Oxford Gazette as the first British newspaper, arriving in 1665. A year later, it became the London Gazette. It was a government publication, more of a list of announcements, and it's still published today. The first daily paper was the Daily Courant in 1702, but it mainly contained news from abroad. And publications had various labels at this time. Beyond books, 3 were significant. None were quite what we would call a newspaper today. There were pamphlets, which were really short booklets. They were ad hoc with no set publication frequency and could cover just about any theme. They were the main instrument of establishment criticism and vocalizing political and religious agendas. Many were produced by the political class themselves. And then there were broadsheets, also known as broadsides, single-sided prints, often ballads or rhymes, telling mystic and societal stories. And finally, there were courantos that originated on the continent. British versions reported foreign news mainly, trade and wars, often translated from the foreign publications. Avoiding home news averted risk of persecution, despite licensing laws having lapsed. But the establishment could see that these formats were evolving, including more home news and bringing more challenge. Newspapers' drumbeat frequency could now become dangerous. Perspective here on scale, newspapers' sales or copies were actually tiny. Bi-weekly and tri-weekly papers were the most popular. Dailies were too costly for most readers, and the coverage was limited, and news not that fresh anyway. Prime reasons for the low volumes was technological. Compiling individual letter stamps into blocks was very slow. Printing was one sheet at a time, with a lot of setting up needed. Now, the London Gazette had many print machines and many staff. The 6,000 circulation is a bit misleading, as bundles were delivered to officialdom's offices, not necessarily seen or read. Main papers had a print run of about 400 to 4,000. And the other 75 newspapers that were around at the time only had about 150 to 200 copies each print. So mass readership is a bit of a fallacy. Top print runs today are about 800,000 a day, though those numbers are falling quite rapidly, or have been recently. So let's get on to the introduction of the taxes. Over the next 10 years, 12 attempts were made to reintroduce some form of press regulation. Only one succeeded, the Blasphemy Act, which is in effect about religious libel. Parliament's rejections had little to do with freedom of speech. There was dislike of the stationers' company, whose monopoly wrought abuses of power, high costs. Instead, they were more focused on sedition laws. But with frequent elections in this period, new MPs liked seeing political information and opinion. However, appetite to curb the press still remained. The trigger came from Queen Anne. She regularly complained about the press. Here's an example, followed by Parliament's commitment to do something about it. Her quote refers to blasphemy, but little in the publications could be described as sacrilegious. Blasphemy had been a euphemism for criticism of royals, caught up with the beliefs that God had given earthly powers to the monarch. Queen Anne was being berated in the pamphlets, not least by Whig politicians, and newspapers started to criticise her handling of foreign affairs. The Statute of Anne was the key document, and it was published in 1712. It was no knee-jerk reaction, with preparation on tax options behind the scenes by the Treasury. In the end, newspapers and pamphlet publications were included alongside duties on soap, hackney chairs, linens, calicos, and gambling. They aligned to a lottery scheme to fund the War of the Spanish Succession. There's a lot of disagreement among historians as to the legislation's prime purpose. Was it economic necessity or to purge newspapers? Most social and media historians say the latter, but economic historians emphasize the fiscal imperative. Looking at the economics, the government needed more income to fund the war. Indirect taxes were the prime fiscal tool of the time. Land tax was no longer able to deliver the scale of monies needed, and income tax was yet to be an acceptable mechanism. Money shortages was hotly debated in Parliament. And with so many products and services being taxed, indirect taxes, emission of print would have looked inconsistent. But understanding the motives for the government wanting to curb the press is much more problematic. Primary historical sources on the establishment's real drivers for press restriction in 1712 is sparse. Complaints about blasphemy and libel fall short of explaining the underlying motives. And historians have relied on contemporary criticism from people like Swift and Defoe, or they've retrofitted much later statements in repeal debates than the original views of the time. Now, this could reflect the lack of surviving records, or politicians of the day are not willing or needing to vocalise their positions as to why they wanted taxes introduced. So this inferred representation could be spin bias, particularly if you superimpose today's values of press freedom. But accepting these limitations, I've grouped the establishment's motives for control into three levels. The first pair are about seeking moral fortitude and religious conformance. The second pair is more pernicious, aiming to protect themselves and their positions from intrusion, allowing them to rule unencumbered. And the last pairing is about retaining the current order. In its inert form, it's about discouraging the masses from wanting to go beyond their station. But it could also be to prevent radical ideas taking hold that could threaten the nation's state. They were all about, and the words were used at the time, wanting a right-minded press, compliant, conformist. And it's difficult to distinguish between them in their practical manifestation. But these themes became recurring justifications of the taxes for the next 140 years. Let's talk about how the taxes actually work, these three taxes. The newspaper stamp duty was charged using two mechanisms, one for newspapers and one for pamphlets. The distinction was based on the number of sheets of paper used, a sheet being a standard size broadsheet, the origins of the term that we use today. At this time, newspapers were normally half a sheet or one standard sheet unfolded, or one standard sheet folded into two, giving 4 printed sides. Tax was for every printed sheet, half a pence, this is old money of course, for half a sheet, and 1 pence for a whole sheet. In contrast, a pamphlet was charged differently. It was a booklet, typically between 2 and 6 sheets. The charge was 2 shillings per sheet, but irrespective of the number of copies produced. So a 2-sheet pamphlet paid 4 shillings, stamp duty, no matter how many copies were made. Paper embossing was done by the stamp department, based in Somerset House, just off the Strand. Hence why London's newspapers industry moved to nearby Fleet Street. The stamp included post office postage charges as well. A detailed record was made for every newspaper's paid duty, and hence gave an early estimation of the size of print runs. The second was the advertising duty, and that was a flat 1 shilling charge for every advert in a newspaper or pamphlet. Advert size, its position, or its topic coverage didn't matter. London and provincial newspapers were charged the same rate, though this changed later on. Most adverts at this time were plain text, 40 to 200 words long, the same as the editorial. The number of adverts in a newspaper varied enormously, from about 3 up to about 30. Paper duty, the last of the 3, was used well beyond newspapers. The largest user was books. The duty was charged based on the paper type, quality and weight. School books, books of devotion, paperwork used in trade and officialdom, and single advert prints were excluded from the duty. British paper manufacturers didn't complain too hard though, because imported paper attracted higher duty rates than that of home manufacture. So that's the 3 taxes and how they were structured in the 1712 bill. Let's talk about what was the impact when they first arrived. There were many newspaper proprietors and writers who expected ruin from the combination of these 3 taxes. Defoe and Swift, for differing reasons, criticised the taxes and expected the demise of print. But this was not the outcome. There were some immediate collapses. 13 titles went, though 8 were probably for a variety of reasons. The number of titles recovered by 1715, and the circulation levels rose over the period. Again, care is needed in terms of the reliability and interpretation of the data. Advert volumes did fall immediately afterwards, by about 50% for the popular London newspapers, The Spectator and The Postboy. But thereafter, adverts volumes also grew, with some newspapers devoting 75% of the space to adverts by 1750. Though advertising duty is intuitively more a restriction of free trade rather than a vehicle for suppression, it was key to newspaper income source, largely determining which newspapers survived and thrived. Newspaper stamp and paper duty caused newspaper price rises. Buying a tri-weekly newspaper became 15% of the average weekly wage, unaffordable purchases by the masses. And the newspapers recharged advertising duty to the advertisers. And so the profile of newspapers' advertising changed. The flat rate 1 shilling charge per advert meant advertising space for premium items remained high. They still saw the commercial benefits. Conversely, it discouraged small business and local personal advertising, particularly stunting provincial newspapers. Adverts for books were the most common prior to the advertising duty arriving, but books were low margin. Book adverts numbers halved. Quackery adverts were very lucrative on the other hand. Volumes were sustained, but the biggest areas of growth was in the expensive property sales, auctions and theatre ads. So expensive advertising rerouted to high-selling, more establishment, right-minded newspapers. The net effect of this is that the taxes did change the profile. They changed who saw newspapers and they changed what they saw. Many previous newspaper readers could no longer afford to buy one, and yet newspaper numbers and prints did rise. Despite the taxes, demand for newsprint was growing. But how many people actually read a newspaper? Coffee houses and inns attracted business by buying papers and allowing customers to read them. And for those that couldn't read, they paid for someone to read it out, a bit like the Tom Hanks film, News of the World. There are records of places where you could hire a newspaper by the hour. Historians have studied newspaper reread levels. Over the 140-year period of the taxes, multi-read levels varied according to many factors, including government purges on loaning of papers. The multiplier figures are much higher than today. Worst hit by the taxes were radical newspapers. Many disappeared, some becoming illegal, unstamped publications. But historians disagree, at least up until 1820, on whether radicalism print was fully suppressed. High levels of reread may have been an outlet for the more radical material. The newspaper industry can be seen as then breaking into 3 camps: the right-minded or establishment papers who paid all their duties. Ironically, these publications, who mainly played by the rules, actually ended up paying the most. The second group was those that published illegally, refusing to pay the taxes, and they were known as the unstamped. And government purges kept trying to shut these down. But the third group, and probably the largest group, was those to avoid the taxes any way they could. The writing of the laws was imprecise, bringing an industry of creative workarounds. Rules fixed were challenged until the system became complex and irrational. And the first workaround is, and it involved the number of sheets of paper, a half sheet and a one-folded created sheet. Examples are the Spectator and the Newcastle Courant. The tax charges for a newspaper of these sizes grew rapidly according to the circulation. The tax implications of going for 1.5 sheets, formerly classified as a pamphlet. There was only a one-off charge, irrespective of the circulation, and charges are much lower for the higher print volumes. Half-sheet newspapers stayed half-sheet publications, but higher circulation papers switched to 1.5 sheets, officially called pamphlets. The British Mercury was the first to exploit this loophole. Extra paper used did cause some problems for them. Filling 6 pages was now difficult. Some introduced book serializations to fill the extra space. Eventually, the authorities tightened the rules against 1.5-page publications, but what constituted a newspaper became a running sore for the authorities. And advertising duty ran into enforcement difficulties right from the start. The statutes required for it to be paid by all and every person and persons who shall print or publish, or cause printed or published, any advertisement. So the advertisers, the printers, and the newspaper proprietors simply pointed fingers at each other, saying they are the people that's supposed to pay, not us. So they resisted the payment. After the initial introduction, newspaper numbers and circulation grew. Advertising grew despite 4 heavy-duty hikes. When the duty fell in the 1830s, advertising accelerated even further. In the end, readers' appetite, better national transportation and distribution, with more productive and lower cost printing, mutually benefited newspapers and the advertisers. It's hard to gauge what proportion of the population actually got to see or hear a newspaper being read. The best guesstimate is about 3% of the population regularly saw a newspaper in 1700, and it rose to about 20%, 1 in 5, by 1800. In the same period, literacy levels, another difficult measure, rose from about a third to a half of the population. Of course, newspapers benefited from improved literacy levels, but they actually also helped to develop it. Newspapers became the prime path for delivery of news. With increased circulation, growing public interest in the news, and more entertaining content, newspaper proprietors and editors' influence grew. Growing advertising revenue gave newspapers more stability and independence. Politicians had previously issued pamphlets to express viewpoints, but newspapers were now the go-to source. Though they could influence newspapers, politicians began to lose control of the political narrative. The government and individual politicians resorted to more direct interventions. They bought newspaper titles, particularly those critical of them, and turned it into the approval voices. In the 1720s to 40s, the master of the press bribery and manipulation was Walpole. It's estimated that he spent over £110,000 of the Treasury's money between 1731 and 41 on newspaper bribes. That's 12 million in today's money. And his tactics varied. He was a very clever man. He gave backhanders for favourable articles. Many journalists at the time were very happy to oblige. Patronage, he gave titles. An editor named James Pitt, that used to be critical, was granted the title of Surveyor of Tobacco with remunerative benefits. He knew nothing about tobacco. The granting of pensions for continued support was another mechanism. And then directed advertising to the favoured newspapers. In 1803, Cobbett lost post office adverts due to a critical article. The last and most effective means was surreptitiously buying newspapers. Through government funds, Walpole owned at least 4 major titles, including the Daily Courant. He bought up hostile titles. The London Journal in 1720 was regularly critical of the government, so Walpole bought it. But the public were wise to this new bias. Circulation nearly halved and advertising revenue declined, forcing Walpole to spend even more money to keep it afloat. And in response to Walpole's manoeuvrings, the Craftsman newspaper was launched in 1726 by 2 disaffected politicians. It was highly critical of Walpole and the government. It was popular, but didn't really cut that much ice. However, it forced Walpole to spend more on influencing through other papers. Sedition laws were the backstop, with wide interpretation and application. Despite these tactics over the longer term, the politicians' influence lessened, though political grants didn't actually end until 1840. There are far too many newspapers to talk about today, but here's some notables. The Times was launched as the Daily Universal Register in 1785 and grew to become the dominant paper, the place for the news. Seen as part of the establishment, that did not mean that it was docile and give open support to the government and the status quo. It could influence government policy and even bring governments down. But it also stifled other newspapers, causing resentment. In the later attempts to bring repeal of the taxes, the Times became the target. Evening newspapers had been around since the early 18th century. It was the main format, given the practicalities of printing and the timing of when couriers left London. A relative latecomer was the London Evening Standard, started in 1827. It had many owners, including the press barons later. For a long period, it had both daily and evening editions until the evening copy won out. Trying to describe the changes over the 140-year lifespan of the taxes is going to be too difficult. So I'm going to break it down into 3 types of change and summarise each. The first is when the government needed more income. And the second was when they were trying to fix loopholes and tackling the newspapers and advertisers' ingenuity to avoid paying the taxes. And the third was dealing with periods of public unrest or increased provocative material. When the government needed more money to fund wars in particular, the taxes rose. Later, the reasons were due to the expanding role of the state and a policy shift to tax luxury goods. And at this point, newspapers were deemed to be a luxury good. But there was a substantial fall in the taxes at the end in the 1830s, and I'll talk about that more later. The scale attack of indirect taxes brought publisher and public scorn with cutting satire. Creativity, let's get to the challenges and people trying to avoid payment. There were many forms of trying to work around the things. The paper duty had different paper classifications and charge rates, so newspapers falsified their returns based on the lowest category of charge. The definition of a newspaper was regularly challenged. When the newspaper stamp rose in 1815, Cobbett's Political Register became too costly for most readers. So we introduced the unstamped 2-penny trash that commented on the news, but it contained no news. Advertising was the thorniest issue. What was an advert? But the definition of advertising didn't help because it evolved. Early on, it meant making something known. Later, it became to persuade people to buy something. The Public Advertisers' Quarterly Charity Meeting announcement befits the early definition. It could easily be slotted into any normal news item. But in contrast, their adverts dressed up as news, complicit newspapers tested the system with disguised advertorials and product name placements. The government stamps department sought to curb abuses. Rules were tightened with ever more idiosyncratic interpretations and burdensome administration. Glowing books reviews were deemed to be adverts. Positive remarks about a venue had advertising duty applied. Reporting horse racing was ruled as a promotion. Rules were inconsistently applied, with the right-minded newspapers given much more leniency. Yet standards of factualness and honesty in adverts wasn't scrutinised by authorities at all. There was public mistrust. Some newspapers barred certain advert types, but in practice it was the Wild West period for adverts content. And this wasn't properly addressed until legislation in the 1880s. Newspapers objected to state interference, yet many sought credentials for integrity and objectivity, differentiated advertising from news, classifying adverts as biased, a lower form. Many papers found themselves dependent on advertising, yet not wanting to be too closely associated with them. There were so many challenges to government authority in the 18th century and in the first half of the 19th century, but I'm just going to choose 3. The 1760s saw a struggle to secure better political representation, including freedom of the press. John Wilkes was a radical who kept being returned to Parliament and then thrown out by the authorities. He was canny, able to challenge and sometimes beat the system. In 1762, he started the North Briton, an anti-ministerial essay sheet. It built up a circulation of around 2,000 copies. Issue number 45 is famous. It attacked the King's speech and his failings for the 1763 Treaty of Paris, ending the 7-Year War. He was charged with seditious libel. Wilkes used parliamentary privilege and stirred the public up to weaken the government's position. Eventually, he fled to Paris, but when he came back, spent a time in prison, but then yet again was re-elected to Parliament. Others made similar attacks through newspapers and were prosecuted, but the juries were reluctant to return guilty verdicts of these publishers, despite them clearly breaking skewed sedition laws. The second period is post the Napoleonic Wars, where there was a very heavy economic slump and high unemployment. Radicalism was rekindled. The Peterloo massacre was a key milestone. Most newspapers defended the government and the local militia's actions. This led to a rise of alternative newspapers. The Manchester Guardian started in 1821, with a left-leaning societal outlook. It became a national, The Guardian, in 1959. In response to the unrest, the government brought in the 6 Acts, various means to suppress political discussion and dissent, probably the strongest since 1620s. One act widened the taxes of knowledge on publications with tighter restrictions and tough pursuit of the wayward. Publishers also had to post a bond based on their own behaviour. Short term, this had the desired effect. Dissent in print was curbed with many prosecutions. The third period, the early 1830s, once again saw a significant disquiet on many fronts: high food prices, the Corn Laws resentment, suffrage and electoral reform demands, and a general push against these indirect taxes. Some reforms were achieved, encouraging more ambition for change. The tax on knowledge banner was first seen in 1815, with full use in the press campaigning from 1830. It wasn't universally accepted. The abrasive Cobbett derided the gutter press high-mindedness. He was not very popular amongst his journalist colleagues. There was revived radicalism with a push for press freedom. Unstamped, i.e. illegal newspapers, were cheap, virulent, and often radical. The titles and the circulation actually exceeded the stamped press. Tax-paying newspapers lobbied the Parliament for some form of action. There was intense lobbying, non-conformance and development of intellectual arguments began. The threat to the authority was considerable. There was an unlawful press advocating unacceptable changes and now reaching the masses. The government's response was stick and carrot. It significantly reduced the duties while introducing stricter controls and punitive measures to deal with renegades. 740 campaigners and participants went to prison or were transported. These measures, at least in the short term, had the desired effect. Unstamped papers largely disappeared, and with it, the radical narrative was constrained. Repeal campaigners' impetus was now fractured. Momentum was lost. Like the 1832 Reform Act, the taxes reduction did little to help the working class. Instead, an expanding middle class now had political representation and wider readership access. However, the system remained flawed. The war of the unstamped had failed, but it rehearsed the agenda for repeal 20 years later. Let's talk about these taxes that are trying to control the press. So repeal momentum was revived in the late 1840s. There were many campaigning organisations involved. And this was a period in the 1840s where almost any committee could be set up on any manner, as far as I can see, that were trying to get 1, 2, or 3 of the 3 taxes removed. Each, unfortunately, had their own agenda. The Association for Promoting the Repeal of Taxes of Knowledge was the most prominent and tried to herd these cats. The repeal motives reflected differing interests, some mutually reinforcing, others incompatible. Many of them were money-based. Free trade, allowing newspapers to expand without tax distortions. They argued it would not only grow the economy, but also bring a more equitable society by making product services accessible to all. It was championed by many newspaper proprietors and the liberalism movement, and they also wanted to see the dominance of the Times checked. Linked to this was a more efficient newspaper industry, being held back by the cumbersome procedures and rules that impeded technological developments. And that was real. The technology changes came in once repeal happened. Some wanted to see the whole indirect taxation system shift to income tax. Chancellor Gladstone's 1850s and the 1860s budgets laid waste to indirect taxation upon consumption. Others had educational aspirations. Now, these are typically characterised as middle class and working class aims. These classifications are oversimplistic, but they do show the contrast since the 1830s, when middle class influence had significantly grown, but working class participation had not. The middle class ambitions range from encouraging enlightenment and self-improvement, promoting morality and good living, through to being an agent to build consent among the lower classes to the expected behaviours and norms that society should have. The working class ambitions were a bit different, but also varied, bringing wider public awareness and understanding, creating life opportunities, access to products and services, and through to social mobility. And it could bring participation in international affairs. Some expected the repeal of the taxes to catalyse a groundswell for demanding better rights. In the extreme, the goal was to engender radicalism, to overthrow the state. Quite a mix of objectives, but those that resisted the taxes removal continued to reflect the desire for press suppression. I'm not going to go through each of these original motives, except to say that there was a realisation that taxes had actually had a limited impact on a number of these aims. During the 1850s, the public were less responsive to radical ideas. Entertaining and salacious newsprint was widespread, and some argue that the press being freed of taxes would foster a more ethical press. No hope there. The original motives for taxation had been eroded by a changing society, alongside reluctant acceptance of the new realities. Motives for repeal were therefore in the ascendancy. Appetite for repeal was unabated, despite some early failing motions in Parliament from 1850. But this time, instead of a head-off confrontation that happened in the 1830s, the tactics were to attack the authorities' own weaknesses. Activities were coordinated to overwhelm the authorities, repeatedly demanding full and consistent implementation of the now cumbersome, idiosyncratic tax system. Test cases on the rules brought the taxes into further disrepute. The intellectual arguments against the taxes on knowledge were retuned and rerun. Lobbying wore down the appetite for the taxes retention. A select committee on newspaper stamps in 1855 concluded, "We do not consider news is in itself a desirable subject for taxation," whilst also saying that revenue generation motives were beyond their consideration. Now, some newspapers who benefited from the restricted competition, the Times included, opposed repeal. Their hypocrisy was well noted. Most had supported repeal of other indirect taxes as being illogical and unfair. Achieving repeal of all three taxes at once was difficult, partly because of the differing views of all the different reformist groups and organisations. So the repealed taxes shifted to pick off one at a time, and it started with advertising duty. A tricky area was how advertising was important to knowledge. Campaigners framed advertising as a communication of essential information and of wants. The arguments were convoluted, but they did identify how people were missing out. People couldn't access job opportunities or see products that could improve their lives. Even so, the arguments on taxes complexity and the peculiarities alongside impediment of free trade were far more influential with the politicians. Campaigning may have shifted the MP's opinion to be more receptive to repeal, but its eventual termination was achieved as much by parliamentary process and muddle. The Chancellor was indecisive and reluctant to repeal the advertising duty. In a late-night parliamentary sitting with few attendees in July 1853, approval of the full budget programme was put in, and it included advertising duty retention, but its rate was slipped in as 0 shillings. So theoretically it still existed, but in practice it was gone. Advertising duty's demise demonstrated a path for other taxes repeal. With different parliamentary processes and intricacies, newspaper stamp duty was repealed in 1855 and paper duty in 1861. The stamp cost did stay, but only when a newspaper was actually using the post system. It's just the same as it was for letters. These three repeals didn't lift the full burden. Press registration and behavioural bonds remained in place until 1869. So the taxes are gone. What happened afterwards? Well, newspaper prices fell. Newspaper titles steadily grew. Circulation expanded tenfold, a massive increase. And this understates the true growth because this is only for the national and London newspapers. Provincials was the biggest growth area, with 123 previously unserved towns of getting local newspapers. So truly, the taxes had held back public access to newspapers. Advertising volume and its diversity also accelerated though the quantity of evidence is quite sparse. Ironically, the advertising duties repeal deprives us of quantitative data on the advert volumes. But individual newspaper examples exist. The provincial paper North and South Shields Gazette saw a growth by 2.3 times in just the 3 weeks after the repeal. And actually, if you look in the newspapers, you get classified adverts, lots of local adverts now starting to appear that before were too expensive. What was actually happening was that newspaper circulation and advertising were in a reinforcing loop of commercial growth. Now, repeal of the taxes has been exalted by many observers as the key realisation point for press freedom. But proclaiming accomplishments depends on which outcome was being sought. Many other historians conclude that the idealistic outcome was not realised. So let's look and see what actually happened. There was more diversity in the types and coverage of the newspapers. The Daily News had already been around. It was originally founded by Charles Dickens. It had a reformist agenda and had been typically read by the progressive middle class. But by 1870, its sales had grown 18-fold of their pre-tax repeal levels, and it was largely read by the wider working class, who had now been engaged. The Telegraph was launched after the repeal. Telegraph communication railways brought faster and more geographical spread news. The Telegraph's newspaper brand heralded this new era. It's quite funny, it's seen as traditional now, but at that point in time, it was seen as very progressive. And it rivaled the Times, whose readership had stagnated after the repeal. The Telegraph was a quarter of the cost of the Times, and its sales surpassed the Times by 1860 and never looked back. The Daily Mail arrived in 1896, specifically targeting women, something the mainstream newspapers until that point had not been focused on, though there'd been many women's magazines for over a century. But let's be really clear here, it wasn't just these high-minded civil press things that grew. There was plenty more of popular, salacious newsprint. An example is the Illustrated Police News. It revelled in crime, violence, and intrigue. Another paper was called, and I can't believe this, the Divorce News. Middle-class ambition for a more civilised press after repeal was at best misguided. Sex, crime, and scandal sold copy, and still does. But behind the more diverse titles was actually some more conformity. Many historians argue that market forces replaced government taxes in making the press underpin social norms and order, if you like, a revised version of a right-minded press. Freed from tax distortions and administrative burden, market forces brought a newspaper industry shake-up. Old dominant newspapers were now fighting with new ventures, bringing new winners and losers. There was then ownership consolidation, and print runs moved from thousands to 10,000s to 100,000s, which needed highly capital-intensive investment. So profit became the essential driver. What emerged were the forerunners to the powerful press barons. Newspaper content and tone affirmed free market principles. However, it could equally be argued that this simply reflected public's desires and aspirations. Working class access to products increased. Situation vacant columns helped access to work. Some societal theories deem this press narrative as slimmable social engineering, equivalent to the propaganda adverts of the left and right-wing states. I think this overstates the newspaper's role and agenda. However, those advocating free trade principles in the repeal saw their ambitions realised. A high-volume radical press failed to emerge. To start with, there was very few of them before the repeal anyway. Unions and the more militant movements couldn't afford to fund the large capital outlays that were now needed. And public appetite for radicalism was lukewarm. In the competitive market, newspapers achieved popularity by responding to readership demand. More space for entertaining content rather than radical lecturing. However, mainstream titles did publish hard-hitting exposés and ran campaigns to address injustices such as slavery and child prostitution. These informed and educated, but they could also divide the readership. That proprietors and editors took such risks indicates that commercial drivers were not the only thing that they were focused on. So radicalism was not awoken as some had hoped, but reform-orientated newspapers provided grit in the oyster. Advertising revenue was absolutely key. It brought profitability for the winners and helped fund their expansion. Subliminally, adverts brought positive identification with social and economic system. Banking and investment adverts started to appear. We see the introduction of consumer advertising and brands. But we also see the rise of classified ads as a place for those everyday wants and needs. Missing people adverts were not seen before the repeal. There are two very differing schools of thought about a historian's view on advertising's influence. Was advertising the midwife of press freedom, or had it replaced the taxes in ensuring right-minded content? Advertising revenue allowed newspaper coverage to broaden and grow journalism's professionalism, and I use that term loosely. The press could take on the role of the fourth estate, if it wished to do so. In this sense, advertising was the midwife. But the contention goes further, that advertising drove newspapers to be more conformist, tone down their narrative, and avoid radical expression. Now, I've done quite a review of the evidence as part of my studies, and I don't think the evidence is there. Advertisers' influence was predominantly free trade commercial power play, seeking to maximise their products and services visibility. They may well have gravitated towards titles with a similar political outlook, but advertising was well spread across the different types of newspaper. There are a few examples, at least in the public domain, where advertisers directly influenced political messaging. Advertisers boycotted the Daily News in 1886 for supporting Irish Home Rule, but many other popular newspapers advocated Home Rule had no such ban. The Pall Mall Gazette lost advertising in its 1886 expose, Maiden Tribute, all about child prostitution. But the advertiser's reaction was more due to the lurid reporting and the editor being imprisoned for child abduction to get the story. Advertisers were much more concerned about managing the risk to sales by association rather than imposing direct political influence. Overall, it's a stretch to say that advertisers replaced governments as enforcers of conformity. Politicians and newspaper proprietors' agendas were far more potent. Advertisers avoided meddling, but spent their money with moderate newspapers, and so in one sense did have indirect influence. What about the politicians then? As described earlier, politicians had much more influence on newspaper content in the past. Yet throughout the tax's lifespan, they were unable to prevent personal criticism of their policy, of their performance, and of the people themselves. Albeit sometimes it cost people their liberty. The taxes repeal was another degradation in politicians' influence. Newspapers became financially independent. Readership interest meant greater space for news and stories of interest rather than politics. And by the time of the repeal, just as the political system had polarised into two parties, so newspaper allegiances followed suit. Unbelievably, you could buy a directory in 1851 that scored newspapers by what political outlook they had. Liberal newspapers at the time embraced what we would call Labour and liberal agendas. But it's hard to find radical publications at this time of any volume. And it wasn't until the 1880s that a plethora of socialist publications arrived. Overall, the evidence suggests politicians' influence was diminished after the taxes repeal, but not significantly so. The threed fourth estate had their power and the ability to hold the establishment to account, but was often partisan in the way it did it. It remained an outlet to promulgate political agendas. The conclusions. The three taxes of Norwich were introduced when previous censorship became unworkable. They lasted for 140 years, favouring right-minded newspapers that narrowed the readership base and what they saw. Despite the taxes, newspapers grew. Setbacks were short-lived. Later tax reductions and their repeal showed the extent newspapers' full potential had been constrained. Advertising revenue was and remained critical to newspapers' survival and expansion. Liberation from political financing stabilised and emboldened the press. Advertisers' influence was commercially driven, but it did reinforce a conformist narrative. Taxes were successful in suppressing radicalism, but they didn't curtail criticism. At the times of perceived threat, authorities had to rely on more direct legislation and purges rather than taxes alone. And the taxes were regularly challenged, but head-on challenges failed. Officialdom's response made the system unwieldy and eventually contributed to its downfall. Repeal came when the motives for taxes was in abeyance and free trade, education, development, and wider social participation aims were in the ascendancy. Not all of the repeal aspirations were realised. They couldn't be. Scandal and salacious stories remained popular. The press could be used for scrutiny and reform, but political allegiances remained a significant influence on the newspaper content, limiting the ambitions of a true fourth estate. Now, today, no tax is paid on newspapers, and since repeal, that has never happened. The government tried to charge VAT for online newspapers, but it was overturned by the courts. Newspapers here still depend on advertising, and adverts are charged VAT. The taxes and knowledge was an episode in our journey to a relatively free press. Thank you.
This podcast has been produced by the Mr. T Podcast Studio in association with the Farnham U3A World History Group. Thank you very much for listening to this talk.